Today, we're going to cover the top three areas that most police candidates struggle with throughout the hiring process. Let's discuss. Hey, before we get started, I have two gifts in the description for you. One is the Getting Started workshop. It's going to walk you through every phase of the hiring process. Plus, there's some hidden bonuses in there I think you will like. Next is a coaching call with any member of the team or even myself, if you'd like, where we can go over your hiring process, your success in the law enforcement career, and how to achieve it faster than what most people can do. Now, there's a lot of different phases, and we're going back to the beginning here. We're going back to the basics because I keep making more detailed trainings and keep considering that not everyone has seen some of the past stuff. So, big thing here is we're going to kind of go back to the basics and reiterate the fundamentals here and what's in there, and then more specifically, then kind of deep dive into these three areas that most candidates are struggling with. So, first off, there's multiple phases to a hiring process, right? If you're trying to become a police officer, then you are either getting started or you have some experience. If you haven't made it through yet, you understand that it's not just, hey, I'm going to go out, I'm going to submit an application, I'm going to do an interview, and I'm going to find out within the month or 2 weeks if I'm hired with this organization. No, you are going to preferably do all your prep work, preparation phase, which is a phase that we created for the hiring process that, in my opinion, is the most important out of all of them because it can make your whole hiring process significantly shorter and smoother. However, you get into these multiple phases of you have to do a written exam followed by a physical exam. And once again, every department's different. So maybe your state or maybe your department waives this or doesn't have this or they're remediating this, whatever. But you have your written, you have your physical, then you're going to have a board interview. Once again, doesn't have to be in this order. Then you're going to have a chief's interview. Then you're going to start your background phase. Then you're going to do your polygraph. Well, first you're going to do your background interview. You're going to fill out your background packet, then do your background interview. Then you're going to do your polygraph, right? That comes with even more forms. Then after the polygraph, you're going to do possibly your med review. And then you're going to do your psych review. And then you may get a final offer. And once again, even if you pass everything, this is something I really want to harp on. Even if you pass everything, it still doesn't guarantee you're going to get hired because at the end of the day, it's employment and they want the best qualified candidate. So if they have 10 open slots and 20 people make it all the way through the hiring process, guess what? 10 are getting those billets, 10 are getting what's called a non-select, which means you passed everything. You weren't selected due to the fact that there was more qualified candidates. So that is a major consideration there. Now, what does it mean for the top three areas? Well, let's back this up here. I mentioned background phase, right? Background phase encompasses a lot, and almost everything past once the background start is included in the background. So your background investigators needs to see your medical exam got signed off, as well as your psychological exam. But specifically what I'm talking about with the background phase is this is one of the three that really gets a candidate jammed up and gets them to not move forward or disqualified. And your background phase, predominantly when I'm talking about this, I mean your PHS, your personal history statement, or your background packet, and your background interview along with the entire investigation. And remember, the investigation is never done until you get your final hire letter and your start date, right? Don't just consider it never complete, because if you get a ticket 2 days before the academy starts, that goes back to the background, and then they can decide not to move you forward from that point on. And just the official reason would be you failed your background, right? So that being said, your background phase mostly composes of those three components, right? Your PHS, your personal history statement, or your background packet, your background interview, which explains any hurdles or any unclear information in your background packet, followed by the investigation and the cumulative results and report that background investigator creates. Now, why is this such a big step for people? Well, because a lot of people get jammed up here. This is where articulation really messes you up if you do it poorly, right? This is where you could have a hurdle that is not excuse me, not necessarily a disqualifying factor, but it can get you disqualified because you misarticulated it. So if I'm going through the background process and I say, hey, um, they ask a question, have you ever engaged in theft? And you say something along the lines of, yes, I stole, you know, a toy when I was a kid, from the store. And they say, okay, anytime else? And then you say, well, it happened a couple times. Okay, well, why isn't that on your PHS? That's called omission, right? That means lying by failing to disclose. And it could have been a mistake. Maybe you just misread the question, but they might not believe you there, right? Because they deal with candidates all day long, and the whole purpose is trying to catch candidates in lying. And they have a list and amount of candidates to get through, and you might be telling the truth and you might have just made a mistake. But that's why we say the preparation phase is key because mistakes just not through the hiring process, they're just almost not allowed. And what I mean by that is, I mean, you might get a good background investigator or hiring official that will hear you out and consider it and move you forward, which is great. I hope they do if a honest mistake was made. But like I said, they're dealing with so many people trying to lie to them all the time that they just do not give you the benefit of the doubt. So the preparation phase, going back to that, key, but that's not one of the three, right? This just we're still on backgrounds. So that is another critical component that we see individuals really struggle with is just filling out the packet correctly and not making a mistake. And then once again, going into the interview and then it's just you just get removed from there because they find a discrepancy based on the investigation that they found and what you said versus what you wrote down on your background packet or what we call your PHS, your personal history statement. Okay, so that's one component of just the background. Then another component of the background is, besides making a mistake on the PHS, is your actual interview. If you kind of go through a situation and you have a hurdle, and let's say it's something as simple as have you ever operated a motor vehicle while consuming alcohol, right? This is a big one that gets a lot of people. Or have you ever operated a motor vehicle after consuming alcohol? Um, well, what's the timeline on that, right? Because if I said to you, hey, do you think it's realistic to say, have you ever consumed alcohol since ever, or have you ever consumed alcohol and then within the next year operated a motor vehicle? You would say yes, but Frank, that's not what they mean there, right? Perfect. Okay. So now we've established that there's a timeline that matters to this, right? And what's the intent here? And the intent is to see if you've ever operated a motor vehicle while you were under the influence of alcohol. Okay, so now we have another timeline here, right? Another timeline is while you're still under the influence of alcohol. So what does that mean? Well, most people will say, well, if I operated a motor vehicle within the same day that I consumed alcohol. So let's say you had a morning mimosa, right? It was, brunch time and you had a 10 a.m. mimosa and then you drove and then you hung out with friends all day downtown and then you drove home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Um, does that count? And some people are unsure about this, right? I get a lot of questions from our coaching candidates on this one. Does that apply? What's the deal? What's the timeline here? And the timeline is physiological, right? It's at what point in time are you no longer impaired by the alcohol that you've consumed? So we've established that, hey, it's unrealistic to say, have you ever consumed alcohol? Let's say you're over the age of 21. Have you ever consumed alcohol and then operated a motor vehicle at any point in time in your life past that? That's unrealistic. All right. So then are we dialing it into the same day? Right? Once again, okay, so if you consume alcohol at 11:59 at night p.m. and then you operate a motor vehicle at 12:01 a.m. the next day, does that count? Well, you're like, well, no, Frank, that's just because a new day has started doesn't. Okay, so now we're not just categorizing into the next day. So then we're looking at it from a physiological standpoint, what your body and how your body processes alcohol. Now, some research will say that you process about one drink every hour, depending on your size and also everything like that. So where I'm going with this is the fact that if you consume alcohol within the same day, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a yes. However, a lot of candidates on their background packet will mark yes to that. When the intent of that question is have you ever operated a motor vehicle while impaired after consuming alcohol? And because of the vagueness of how it's worded or the words chosen, it's commonly misrepresented, even though it's in the criminal element section typically, right? Which means have you ever engaged in operating a motor vehicle under the influence, which is driving under the influence in some states, DWI, driving while intoxicated in others, operating under the influence, OUI in other states. It's different all over the country, right? And in other countries, it's categorized as different too. So then, how do you know if you're right? Well, one, it comes down to, your heart and soul. Is if you feel that you were impaired at any point in time when you operated a motor vehicle, then mark yes and be honest and just articulate, that it was a past dumb mistake and you refrained from doing it for a multiple amount of years since then. And hopefully it was only ever one time or not a lot of times, we'll say it that way. But typically what I find with most candidates is it's not that, right? It's typically is they're trying to be honest, but in an attempt to be honest, they're actually overt, they're actually lying, trying to be fully transparent. And I hear that from a lot of people. People are like, I'm just trying to be transparent. I want you to be honest, not transparent. I want you to be truthful and honest, right? And if you lie in an attempt to be transparent and it negatively affects you because it's not the truth, that's not what they're looking for. They just want the truth from you. Have you ever operated a motor vehicle while you were impaired? That's what that question is asking for. And you need to answer it truthfully, right? Because they're going to find out during the polygraph. So so that's the other concept of the background stage is filling out your packet and then also what you disclose in your interviews as well, how you articulate those facts. All right, so the next one is your polygraph. And you're probably saying, Frank, this is a no-brainer, of course, and you can go check the comments on almost a lot of videos that we discuss polygraph and even some that we don't, where people will just bash the polygraph. You're right. It is not a legal system that you can use in court with certain contexts. Some courts you can use it or it does assist. But anyway, typically it's not allowed to be used in any type of criminal trial, right? Yes. Why? Because there's flaws in it. And what are the major flaws of it? One is interpretive, right? Is while it is a machine recording certain indications, it's being interpreted by human. And what's if you new to this channel or if you've heard it before, the one thing I can never prepare you for is human error. I can't prepare you for that polygrapher or that polygraph examiner that spilled their coffee on them that morning, that didn't get any sleep because of their kids, that their spouse or their boyfriend or girlfriend just broke up with them and they're in a bad mood and they want to take it out on somebody and you're the next person they see. I can't prepare you for that. And guess what? I'll let you in on a little secret. That's every phase of the hiring process, right? I can never prepare you for human error and some type of human making, breaking the law or violating policy or not following no matter what I do, I can teach you how to deal with those people, but I can't prepare you for whether or not it's going to happen, right? You can be the humble professional when dealing with them, but at the end of the day, if they fail you because they have some type of bias or something like that, you can report them, yes, but there's nothing that myself or any other individual can possibly do to tell you, hey, you're going to walk into it and this is exactly what's going to happen and this is how you're going to. No, because you just don't know and you hope you're not going to have to deal with that. But unfortunately, human error is a factor. Thankfully, it tends to be mitigated, but it's still there in every aspect, in every profession, in every way of life, right? So you're going over, we're at the polygraph. The big thing that I see here with the polygraph is once again, making sure your prep work, all that stuff on your background is good and accurate and honest because you're going to have to fill out another form for the polygraph. And it's called a polygraph pre-screening form. And it's going to be pretty much all your criminal history stuff. Now, here's the catch-all. Sometimes it might be worded differently. So one question that didn't apply before might trigger a response on on the pre-screening form where you're saying, hey, I mark no over here, but I have to mark yes to this because it'd say, have you ever stolen anything since you turned 18 on your background packet? It says no. But then on the polygraph pre-screening form, it says, have you ever stolen anything? And let's go back to the original. Yeah, when I was 5, I took a toy from the store. My parents got mad at me and I had to return it, and I didn't know what I was doing. But you're going to say no over here to theft and yes over here. And that's a discrepancy that you're going to have to articulate. And if you cannot articulate that clearly, and the polygrapher is going to say, why did you mark no on your background packet to have you ever stolen anything? And you're going to say, oh, I don't recall that question. Well, it says it. I'm looking at it right here, and they're not going to show. Oh, can I see it? No, I'm telling you, it says it right here. Oh, well, if that's the case, then I made a mistake on that, and it should be yes because I did take something when I was 5 years old. Well, they're going to DQ you probably right there once again for omission, right? Had you saw the document, you would see that once again, human error probably applied, or the polygrapher was just trying to make a name for themselves or whatever. And they wanted to DQ you because, or they got to DQ you, right? And maybe that makes them happy. I don't know. People are weird, right? So you go in and you state yes on one, no on the other, and they say, hey, it says it right here. And maybe you did miss that question, but unlikely. And you change your answer, and then all of a sudden they DQ. You don't even take your polygraph exam. You get DQ'd right during your pre-screening form and your pre-screening interview. And it happens, right? Which is why when people say, hey, how should I prepare for my polygraph? I say, study your PHS, right? Because that's what's going to matter the most is being consistent and honest. So then now you get into your actual, let's say you make it through, everything checks out. Now you get into it and you take your polygraph and they say that you see some flags, or they say they see some flags on some questions. And you stay consistent and truthful, and they say, nope, if you don't give me something, I'm going to have to fail you. And then you deviate. And you think, maybe they spend a half hour on this, right? 30 minutes, and it's just a straight up interrogation. And people are sitting here saying that wouldn't happen. Go check the comments. I promise you, it happens all the time, right? And so they interrogate you for 30 minutes. No, no, there's a flag here, something. And then you say, hey, and this literally happened. I had a candidate that was doing this, and they sat in and they thought just, oh man, I just want to move this along. Yeah, maybe I did, try marijuana one more time than I thought. And that the polygrapher says, oh, okay, no worries. Gets up with a big smile on their face, walks out, comes back in and says, hey, no, unfortunately, you're no longer in the hiring process. Please leave. That happens, right? More often than you think. Be honest, be consistent, and stick to it. All right. So now that's your actual pre-screening, or your pre-screening exam, followed by your pre-screening interview, followed by the actual polygraph, followed by the post-interview. And by the way, in the post-interview, they can lie to you. They can say they can see a flag. Now, you don't know if it's true or not, but they can say they see a flag and, hey, just give me something. I've seen it. Don't listen, we just need to know so we can explain this one-off thing. And the minute you deviate, you're done. Okay, so that's a quick synopsis of the polygraph. Now let's get over to the psych. The psych has quickly become one of the most disqualifying factors in the hiring process. And I have some qualms with it. I really appreciate the psych. I think it's a very much needed aspect. But I think psychologists have overstepped their scope of authority here, and I should say authority, scope of practice, right? Because technically they're supposed to be medical professionals. Um, and yeah, it's become a conundrum. I've seen them be really rough on 21 or younger, but 21 to 26 years old, 6-year olds. There we go. I've seen them be really rough on them for maturity, looking for maturity with them. I've seen them be really rough on older candidates, saying, "Why would you ever want to change and leave a career for law enforcement?" And I just tend to see a bias based on I see a bias against law enforcement by the psychologists that are supposed to be evaluating good law enforcement officers. Um, I also see that because most psychologists that you will go through are called third party examiners, right? Which means they don't work for the department. They're a company hired by the department to evaluate you. Well, I've seen them kind of do some, this isn't all, but I've seen them kind of do kind of shady stuff where where it's kind of a money grab sometimes. They will evaluate a candidate with one department, and then that candidate will be applying with another department, and within the same week or two, they'll reevaluate that same candidate just to get more compensation from another government contract from one department and then another department, even though they failed them a week ago. And you can't reasonably say they're eligible for re-examination within a week if from your department, maybe a different department, but you can't say that your department can be unbiased enough after one of your colleagues or maybe even you, as a psychologist, have failed them. Anyway, I digress. But the big thing here is that they're they're no longer evaluating your kind of mental fortitude and your ability to maintain composure and your ability to deal with the stressors of the profession. Now they've kind of turned into another background check where they'll review all your hiring documents, your background, everything like that. One of the things that I will find that I find ironic here is these are psychologists who really promote, mental health. And, if you follow that practice, you look at mental health the same as physical health. You should exercise your brain and if you went into the gym and got a personal trainer, no one would bat an eyelash at that. But if you went to the doctors and got a therapist, right, for to increase your mental fortitude, then that's considered a negative in the process, and they want to see all the notes, and I don't understand it. It kind of seems counterintuitive to the profession, in that aspect, and all the psychologists that I know haven't really given me a good argument for that one as to why they look at it that way. But I will tell you from all our analytics, all our information over here, and we have quite a bit. I would say 99% of all psychologists look at, if you've ever sought any type of mental health treatment. I shouldn't even say treatment, any type of mental health growth, right? Where, I'm specifically talking about speaking to a therapist or speaking to a psychologist, um, they look at that as a negative. And it's unfortunate because that is their profession, and it kind of, for me, I view it as, you're not really standing behind your profession of the being able to grow and exercise your mental health. But once again, that's another digression. So big thing here is with them, rough on 21 to 26-year olds. They're pretty rough on military. If you're coming out of the military, they're pretty much going to be rougher on you than a civilian off the street. If you're an older candidate, they're going to be pretty rough on you. I've seen a lot of bias in the psychological realm for the hiring process, unfortunately. Something we're always trying to work on, and we're trying to always improve the hiring process in general. But just know I mean, the psych is something, and we have plenty of videos out there on it, and we'll be making more. But that is definitely an area that I find to be very touchy. And the unfortunate part is typically it's the second to last or the last part of the hiring process. So you can make it all the way through the hiring process and have a third party examiner who has no affiliation with the department, just tell you no. And then they kind of hide behind the fact that the department doesn't have to share the results with you. So you can't challenge them. So they can write anything in the report, and you're not going to be able to see it. And then, but other departments will. So that's the unfortunate aspect of it. Um, yeah, it is definitely a conundrum, and it's definitely something we always work on, and we try to improve, one thing at a time. But those three areas are the three areas that most individuals throughout the hiring process struggle with, right? So your background, specifically your background packet and interview, followed by your polygraph, which is every aspect of the polygraph. Sometimes people mess up in the pre-screening form, sometimes they mess up in the pre-screening interview, sometimes the post-interview. Now, to kind of hit on the poly real quick, that being said, I've had a candidate fail multiple polygraphs before starting to work with us. And then after working with us, still struggled with polygraphs, but never failed another one, right? And that's just because they made sure that they were honest and then they stayed consistent to it. So that's the quickest advice I can give you. Jumping back to the psychological exam, that is where I see the most bias from individuals, from psychological evaluators in this process. But I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm just trying to prepare you for the truth. This is the way the world works, right? One of the things the psychologists are supposed to look for is bias. So it's irony that a lot of times I see the most bias from them. But yeah, it's just an area and a section you have to prepare for. And we have plenty of videos, like I said, on that, and we'll be putting out more. So don't get discouraged. You got this. Those are just the areas that I truly believe articulation best prepares you for. Because if you can articulate any answers or any type of hurdles that they throw at you, you have a much better way of burning through it. I have some other things, but we'll save that for another time. All right. I hope this helps. Once again, we have those gifts in the description. The Getting Started workshop is going to walk you through every phase in the hiring process, plus some hidden bonuses I think you will enjoy, followed by a coaching call with any member of the team or even myself, where we can jump on, discuss any of these three or any other aspects to your hiring process or your law enforcement career. Hope this helps. Stay safe, and I will see you next time.